The concept of race, we are often told, is a social construct with no basis in biological reality. Some have argued that it was invented by white Europeans for the express purpose of constructing a racial hierarchy in order to justify slavery. According to cultural critic Keenan Malik, racism gave birth to race. The ancestors of today's African Americans were not enslaved because they were black. They became classified as a distinct and inferior race as a means of justifying their enslavement. This view is even espoused by some scientific institutions. And yet, by analyzing your genome, companies like 23andMe can describe your ancestry, and their reports match people's own accounts of their racial ancestry to a high degree of accuracy. As humans spread across the globe, they tended to breed within ancestral groups, such that gene flow within groups became greater than gene flow between groups. This led to a pattern of shared ancestry clustering that is still apparent across the world. As a result, we can usually differentiate at a glance between people whose ancestry can be traced back multiple generations in, say, Japan, from those whose ancestors came from Ethiopia or Norway. It is these clusterings that we refer to by the term race, a common language term that predates Enlightenment science. Despite the fact that there is obviously some biological underpinning to what we call race, many people claim that races are purely sociological. They argue that races could only be real if they were clearly demarcated, discrete categories and thus countable, or that for races to be real, they must be essentialist categories, i.e., there must be at least one trait shared by all the people of race A and by no one who is not of race A. In support of this, leading geneticist Richard Lewontin pointed out that genes vary just as much within a race as between races. While this is true, it does not negate the reality of races. Our ancestry is manifest in correlated patterns of genetic variation, and these correlated patterns are both real and meaningful and reveal our ancestral groupings. Furthermore, while many dismiss race as only skin deep, AI software can discern a patient's race just by analyzing medical X-rays. The AI cannot just be reflecting human bias when it does so, since it is discerning patterns of which human experts are unaware. Many people believe that the scientists of the European Enlightenment got the issue of race badly wrong because they were motivated by prejudice and racism, and that this irredeemably tainted race science from the start. In fact, I would argue that many of them were driven by scientific curiosity, and they were both more insightful and more correct than is often supposed. To make this case, I'm going to focus on the so-called founding father of anthropology, Johann Friedrich Blumenbach, 1752 to 1840, curator of the Museum of Natural History at the Georg August University of Göttingen, and perhaps the foremost race scientist of the era. I'll be quoting from his major works On the Natural Variety of Mankind, 3 editions, 1775, 1781, 1795, and Contributions to Natural History, 1790-1806, both of which are available in English translation by Thomas Bendeich in an 1865 compilation published by the Anthropological Society of London. Building on Linnaeus's systematic categorization of the world's species, Blumenbach sought to apply a similar scientific analysis to human variation. One of his primary tasks was to decide whether humans are all one species with a single origin, an idea known as monogenism. Blumenbach's contemporary, Christoph Meiners, among others, argued for a polygenist account in which humans originated as several distinct creations. This was prior to Darwin, so a creationist account was taken as a given. But while Meiners was a philosopher and historian, Blumenbach was a scientist, though the term had not yet been coined. That is, he sought to answer questions of human diversity through a thorough and detailed consideration of the anatomy of both humans and animals. On this, he was an expert. His 1805 Manual of Comparative Anatomy was regarded as the authoritative work on the subject. For Blumenbach, such questions could not be decided on the basis of any one trait alone, but only by considering multiple factors, including skin, hair, eyes, facial appearance, and other features. Blumenbach first asked how humans differ from apes like the orangutan. He recounts that some famous men who are, quote, ill-instructed in natural history and anatomy have deduced that, quote, this ape is very nearly allied, and indeed of the same species with themselves. Blumenbach firmly rejects this view, arguing that a wide range of skeletal and other traits demonstrate man's natural position to be an erect one, and to separate him fairly from the apes, especially from the orangutan. He then asks, are men, and have the men of all times and of every race, been of one and the same, or clearly of more than one species? He writes that ill-feeling, negligence, and the love of novelty have induced persons to take up the latter opinion, and notes that, on the first discovery of the Ethiopians and other races by Europeans, it was much easier to pronounce them different species than to inquire into the structure of the human body, to consult the numerous anatomical authors. But having evaluated the evidence, Blumenbach writes, I do not see the slightest shadow of reason why I, looking at the matter from a physiological and scientific point of view, should have any doubt whatever that all nations, under all known climates, belong to one and exactly the same common species. He declares, there is not a single one of the bodily differences in any one variety of man which does not run into some of the others by such endless shades of all sorts, that the naturalist or physiologist has yet to be born, who can with any grounds of certainty attempt to lay down any fixed bounds between these shades, and consequently between their two extremes. So why then do humans vary? That question would be answered decades later by Charles Darwin, but Blumenbach's hypothesis was along the right lines. He argued, in effect, that the differences between the races are adaptations to different climates. Taking the example of skin color, he notes that, in spring, very elegant and delicate women show a most brilliant whiteness of skin, contracted by the indoor life of winter, whilst those who are less careful in this way, after they have exposed themselves freely to the summer sun, become sensibly browner. If then, under one and the same climate, the mere difference of the annual seasons has such influence in changing the color of the skin, is there anything surprising in the fact that climates should have the greatest and most permanent influence over national color? Blumenbach seems to have assumed a Lamarckian inheritance of acquired characteristics, building up over generations. Again, this was prior to Darwin. Blumenbach argued that the range of different environments across the world is sufficient to explain the differences between human races. Nowadays, we'd also factor in genetic drift and perhaps sexual selection. He supposes that there was an original or primitive form of Homo sapiens, and asks, how does the primitive species degenerate into varieties? The word degenerate here should not necessarily be read as having derogatory connotations. It seems to have meant only having undergone change from the original as a result of adaptation to novel environments. Applying this to animal species, he speculated that there are sources of degeneration which only by long and daily action, continued through many series of generations, are sufficiently strong, slowly, and by little and little, to change the primeval character of animals and produce varieties, and writes, I will bring forward one or two instances of degeneration which seem most clearly to be derived from the effects of climate. For example, the white color of many animals in northern regions, which have other colors in the temperate zones. Blumenbach believed that such effects would be especially pronounced in humans. The more causes of degeneration which act in conjunction, and the longer they act upon the same species of animals, the more palpably that species may fall off from its primeval conformation. Now, no animal can be compared to man in this respect, for he is omnivorous and dwells in every climate, and is far more domesticated and far more advanced from his first beginnings than any other animal. And so on him, the united force of climate, diet, and mode of life must have acted for a very long time. Blumenbach proposed a classification scheme that grouped humans into 5 different races: Caucasian, Mongolian, Ethiopian, American, and Malay. But he did not argue that these were discrete, countable, essentialist categories. On the contrary, he emphasizes the fact that innumerable varieties of mankind run into one another by insensible degrees. No variety exists so singular as not to be connected with others of the same kind by such an imperceptible transition that it is very clear they are all related, or only differ from each other in degree. He also understood that races cannot be distinguished by any one trait or character, but only by bundles of correlated traits. I must prefix a double warning. First, that on account of the multifarious diversity of the characters, according to their degrees, one or two alone are not sufficient, but we must take several joined together. And then, that this union of characters is not so constant, but what it is liable to innumerable exceptions in all and singular of these varieties. Here, Blumenbach refutes Lewontin's argument 180 years before it was made. The key is not variation in individual traits, but correlated patterns of trait variation. Far from propounding an essentialist conception of races that are discrete and countable, Blumenbach argues the exact opposite case. So why categorize humans into races at all? After all, differences cannot always be grouped into discrete countable categories. Gradual variation, which biologists call clinal variation, is just as real. But there is a real and meaningful difference between an adolescent and an adult, and between summer and autumn, even though there is no clear bright line dividing those temporal stages. Furthermore, the branching structure of an oak tree is real, even though the branches are not countable, since there is no unambiguous distinction between a small branch and a large twig. Blumenbach knew that his scheme incorporated a degree of ambiguity. But even within a clinal variation, some differences are larger than others. Oceans, mountain ranges, and deserts provide natural barriers to gene flow, and thus we should expect shared ancestry to cluster in ways that map onto the world's continents. Blumenbach is trying to discern real patterns within natural variation, not impose arbitrary schemes upon nature. As we might expect, Blumenbach's scheme maps onto geographical barriers. So, was Blumenbach right? Today, we can source genomes from around the world and run statistical analyses to look for clusterings. For example, in 2016, Swapan Malik and his colleagues used statistical codes to look for the 5 biggest clusterings in a set of genomes from 300 people. Their findings were strikingly similar to Blumenbach's, though his terminology was more archaic. The clusters corresponded to sub-Saharan Africans, Blumenbach's Ethiopians, Oceanians, Malayans, East Asians, Mongolians, Native Americans, Americans, and West Eurasians, Caucasians. Thus, Blumenbach was broadly right. His categories are not a perfect match for modern genome clusterings, but given the evidence available to him more than 200 years ago, he did well. As Noah Rosenberg and his colleagues explain in a 2005 paper, when individual genomes are clustered solely by genetic similarity, individuals sort into broad clusters that correspond to large geographic regions. And while allele frequency differences generally increase gradually with geographic distance, small discontinuities occur as geographic barriers are crossed, allowing clusters to be produced. These clusterings arise from genuine features of the underlying pattern of human genetic variation. They conclude that, loosely speaking, it is these small discontinuous jumps in genetic distance, across oceans, the Himalayas, and the Sahara, that provide the basis for the ability of statistical codes to identify clusters of genomes that correspond to geographic regions. The authors again confirm that Blumenbach's model was more right than wrong. Considering 1,056 individuals from 52 human populations, we found that individuals could be partitioned into 6 main genetic clusters, 5 of which corresponded to Africa, Europe, and the part of Asia south and west of the Himalayas, East Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. One key question remains. Was Blumenbach motivated by a desire to establish a racial hierarchy? He did regard the Caucasians as the primitive, i.e. original race. In this, he was influenced by Christoph Meiner's declaration that Caucasians are the most, quote, beautiful human beings, a clear example of Meiner's bias. Blumenbach may also have been influenced by the belief that Noah's Ark landed on Ararat in the Caucasus. Many people believed in the literal truth of the biblical account in those days, and therefore presumed that Caucasians were descended from those who disembarked with Noah. He also proffered the better, but still wrong, argument that, since sun exposure darkens light skin, but the absence of sunlight doesn't lighten dark skin, darkening must be a one-way process. He thus proposed that, from the Caucasian original, human beings developed into two varieties, most remote and very different from each other. On the one side, namely, into the Ethiopian, and on the other, into the Mongolian, while the intermediate positions are occupied by the American, between the Caucasian and Mongolian, the Malay, between the same Caucasian and Ethiopian. But that is the extent to which he proposed any hierarchy. He did go wrong by presuming that one of the extant races had to be the original one. Thanks to Darwin, we now understand that all of today's races are equally evolved from a common African ancestor. But perhaps Blumenbach had some inkling of this, given his remark about how changed all human beings are from those who existed in the first beginnings. When Blumenbach describes sub-Saharan Africans more directly, he certainly does not sound as if he thought them inferior to Europeans, either morally or intellectually. In his 1790 book, Contributions to Natural History, Blumenbach writes, "It has been asserted that the Negroes are specifically different in their bodily structure from other men, and must also be placed considerably in the rear from the condition of their obtuse mental capacities. Personal observation, combined with the accounts of trustworthy and unprejudiced witnesses, has, however, long since convinced me of the want of foundation in both these assertions." After citing many examples of Negroes of capacity, whom he considers comparable to the inhabitants of well-known provinces of Europe, he concludes that there is no so-called savage nation under the sun which has so much distinguished itself by such examples of perfectibility and original capacity for scientific culture, and thereby attached itself so closely to the most civilized nations of the earth as the Negro. Those do not read like the thoughts of a man motivated by a desire to establish a racial hierarchy that would justify slavery. Blumenbach got a lot right, and he drew his conclusions, as a scientist should, from a thorough analysis of the anatomical evidence. He asserted that humans are all one species, and he knew that, while humans vary across the world, this variation is only a matter of degree. Hence, he knew that any categorization of humans must have a degree of fuzziness and ambiguity. Nevertheless, he correctly discerned a real clustering pattern within that variation, a pattern that is borne out by genome analysis today. It is to this pattern that he applied racial labeling. In today's world, it is fashionable to deny that races are real in any scientific sense, since they are not discrete, countable essentialist categories. Yet that's not how the concept of race was defined, at least not by monogenists like Blumenbach and later Darwin, who became the scientific mainstream after winning out over polygenists like Meiners and Samuel Morton on purely scientific grounds. The idea that there are discrete, essentialist races is part of the long-dead theory of polygenism. It is not part of the biological conception of race that has been mainstream ever since Blumenbach. In everyday parlance, racial categories are not always well aligned with biological categories. The American one-drop rule is sociological, not biological, as is the American concept of Hispanic people, which includes a mixture of different populations. But we would not reject the concept of energy in physics just because some everyday uses of the word don't fit that idea. Ironically, it is not the concept of race itself that is a purely sociological phenomenon, but the belief that we must reject race. The supposition that we must do away with the idea of race entirely if we want to combat racism is a misconception. It confuses moral values with facts about the world, and any good scientist, and Johann Blumenbach was a good scientist, needs to separate the two. Thank you for listening. Welcome to Quillette Narrated. The following article is Johann Blumenbach, the First Race Scientist, written by Coel Hellier, read by Iona Italia.